Hey everybody, Eric here, and today I'm with my friend Jonathan McClatchy from Talk About Doubts, and we are going to be discussing a video by Genetically Modified Skeptic regarding the relevance for arguments for God. Why are believers actually believers? Do arguments for God play any kind of role in that whatsoever? Or do believers believe for other reasons? And I really wanted to have Jonathan with me here today. Thanks for joining me, Jonathan, because this has a lot to do with religious epistemology. Cognitive bias is something that Drew is going to be touching on in the video. Even though he doesn't necessarily use that term, it definitely is something that he's suggesting. And just why people believe, and that does overlap, I think, a lot with the people that you counsel with Talk About Doubts and different things like that. So thanks so much for joining me. Before we jump in, do you want to just kind of talk about the ministry and just kind of what you do, and then we'll just get started from there?
Sure. So I run a ministry, as you said, called talkaboutdoubts.com. You can see the address on my hat there. And basically, the way it works is someone lands on our website and submits a form, and then we distribute that to one of our scholars. We have assembled a team of over 60 scholars in different subjects: philosophy, physics, biology, New Testament scholarship, Old Testament scholarship, textual criticism, what have you. And that scholar that we think is best suited for that question will get in contact with the inquirer and will schedule a private Zoom call to discuss with them their doubts in confidence. And so that's a little bit about talkaboutdoubts.com. We also have a growing Discord community of past inquirers, and we run weekly hangouts on Zoom for our past inquirers as well, and we also have monthly panel Q&As that we host, and we're also planning in the new year to do a series of in-person events for inquirers of Talk About Doubts as well, in different parts of the country, and also eventually internationally too.
Awesome. And the other reason I wanted to have you on is Cosmic Skeptic does make an appearance, and I know that's something that you've debated Cosmic Skeptic. You've debated a number of different skeptics. And so I kind of wanted to get your take on some of his comments as well. And so I think it'll be fun. Should just be kind of a casual time. And so without further ado, I'm going to bring Drew here on the screen, and we're just going to watch the video. Obviously, I'll put a link in the description to the video, but we're going to watch it in its entirety. So if people want to check it out, that's fine. Don't go over to Drew's page and leave angry comments or anything else like that. This is just meant to be constructive criticism. And so anyway, here we go.
Say about what I think, but I think that a few responses will probably be big mad. So looking forward to that. Anyway, let's talk about sociology.
Okay, real quick. Yeah, I know I'm big mad. I mean, I am shooketh by this video. No, I'm just kidding. I think this is a good opportunity. I kind of didn't rewind all the way to the beginning, but that's okay. Really what I think Drew is giving us a good opportunity to talk about is religious epistemology, is why believers actually do believe. And I don't think it's anything at all to be alarmed about or offended about. I think Drew does kind of point out maybe some weaknesses with maybe Reformed epistemology, which we'll get into in a minute, because I actually saw a lot of Christians who watched this video and are like, yeah, I don't have any problem with what he's saying. And I'm thinking, like, I don't think that believers quite understand how evidential their faith really is. But we'll get into that in a moment. So anyways, I just wanted to throw that out there. Nobody is big mad or little mad even going into this.
Sociologists and scholars of religious studies often utilize what's called the 3B framework of religion and religious identity formation. The 3 Bs stand for beliefs, behavior, and belonging. The belief dimension consists of ideas about theology, philosophy, ethics, cosmology, etc., held within a religion. The behavior dimension consists of actions which religious individuals and groups take, such as rituals, rites, daily devotional practices, prayer, holidays, etc. Belonging refers to an individual's sense of membership or belonging to a group or identity. Here in the Protestant Christian-dominated US, we often think of religion primarily as a set of beliefs, and that any religious behavior or belonging must spring from that. This can be seen in the way we often refer to religious people as believers. Even in the case of Protestant Christianity, though, that is overly simplistic. Behavior like church attendance is obviously important for many, but I'd argue that extremely popular and socially enforced behaviors like getting married, being monogamous, and having kids are just as integral to that identity. Identifying as Christian and affiliating with Christian-aligned groups is popular, even for those who may not belong to a formal congregation. Many find a sense of belonging among Christians and identify themselves as such, even if they know or care little about Christian doctrine. Christianity is not just a matter of belief, it's a matter of behavior as well as belonging. In fact, I'd argue that this belonging and behavior are not a product of belief, but that belonging and behavior, for most people, actually precede belief. I think this is true of religion in general, but I'll speak in terms of Christianity here. If you'd like to see a scholar of religious studies discuss this in terms of religion more broadly, you'll find a link to a video by Religion for Breakfast in the description. So why think that Christian belief springs from behavior and belonging? Here are a few reasons. Most Christians were brought up as Christians from a young age, engaging in rituals like prayer and worship, as well as feeling a sense of belonging in a Christian group and household well before reaching an age where they could comprehend the doctrine Christians believe. Many Christians, whether lay people or esteemed philosophers, profess that their belief is rooted in their own spiritual experiences, most of which were brought on by religious behavior like intense prayer, worship, and other rituals. In Christian culture and education, apologetics, or just reasons to believe Christianity in the first place, are most often presented to people after they already consider themselves Christians. If belief stems from behavior and belonging, then what does this tell us about arguments for God and other Christian beliefs? Such arguments serve to reinforce pre-existing belief, and for most Christians, interact fairly little with behavior and belonging. Discussing these arguments is not necessary or culturally expected behavior for Christians, and they don't provide a sense of belonging for most. This is why most Christians don't really know or care about them. They only serve to prop up belief, but belief, for most, is already propped up by behavior and belonging, so they offer relatively little utility for most. In this way, such arguments are not important to Christian faith. Why then do a minority of Christians speak about them so much? I do think these arguments provide utility to these Christians, but not in the way or degree that you might think. Apologetic.
Yeah, yep. I was just about to actually. Go ahead.
So, does it follow that because one grew up with a certain set of beliefs and the way that one's beliefs originated is because of parental influence, does it follow from that that the justification that one has now for retaining one's beliefs is rational as opposed to rational? I don't think that that's the case. I mean, I grew up in a heliocentric believing home. I don't know about yourself, but I also grew up in a home that believed that dinosaurs existed, and that I grew up believing that before I knew about the evidence that actually establishes that dinosaurs existed and that the Earth goes around the sun and not the other way around. And nonetheless, the reason why I now hold those beliefs is because of rational justification, empirical data that supports those propositions as being true. So merely the fact that one grows up in a certain environment with certain beliefs imparted by parents, it doesn't follow that one's current rational justification is non-rational. Anything to add to that, Eric?
Well, yeah, and I mean, I think just because you were raised in a certain environment that is reinforcing certain kind of, I don't know, behaviors and rituals and different things that Drew is going to go on to talk about, it doesn't mean that just that these even children are operating without any sort of evidence for God whatsoever themselves. I mean, I think when I was a child and I would go outside and look at nature and the stars and the kind of order and beauty of the universe, that reinforced a belief in me that there is a God. And maybe I wouldn't be able to discuss the teleological argument or something with somebody and spell it out in a syllogism as a child. But it doesn't mean that I was operating without any evidence whatsoever that would fall in any kind of rational type of category. Nor do I think when, like, say, you're talking about biblical stories to a child, maybe you're reading from them, reading the Gospels to them, and they just, from different maybe clues that they get from the text, they're reading them as this is testimony. This is some kind of data. This purports to be some kind of testimony. I think that people can understand, like, is this just tall tales or whatever? or is somebody lying here, or somebody deceived? Now, of course, children aren't going to be able to pick that up as well. I mean, they believe in all kinds of myths and different things like that. But I think that they can at least look at these things on face value and say, hey, where do these things come from, and ask questions. My kids ask me questions all the time, and there's ways that I can explain things to them. And so just because you're brought up in a religious home, I don't think that even children are operating without any sort of evidence for God whatsoever. Does that make sense?
That's totally correct. As you
Yeah.
said, there's an appropriate distinction between an explicit rational justification and a tacit rational justification. And I think most Christians, including children, have a rational justification, at least for the existence of a creator. I think that the evidence of a creator is clearly perceived. I think Paul got it right in Romans 1:20. God's nature and divine attributes are clearly perceived through what has been made, so that men are anapologetos without an apologetic, because I think that the existence of God is evident from the created world. And one might not be able to debate Graham Oppy or some atheist philosopher, but nonetheless, one has an implicit justification, even if it couldn't be explicitly expressed.
Yeah, exactly. And so I'll let him continue. We'll kind of build on that theme, I'm sure, as we go along here.
Reasons and arguments for the faith are nearly always utilized responsively. Interest in apologetics usually begins as a response to doubt, whether the doubt of others or one's own. A common backstory for a professional apologist or an apologetics enthusiast is that they began to doubt their faith as they got older or more educated, feared they'd lose their faith, especially their sense of belonging, and sought out ways to reinforce it. Alternatively, a loved one may have left the faith, so the Christian, unable to coerce that loved one into engaging in ritual or affiliating with their faith community, sought out ways to argue their loved one back into belief. For these Christians, I won't deny that arguments for their faith are important to them. I do not, however, believe that they are necessary to their faith most of the time. After all, as many apologists will openly say, if they did not have such arguments, they would still be Christian. This should tell us that their belief is reinforced elsewhere, likely by behavior and belonging. What does engaging with these arguments accomplish? We must understand then that when we non-Christians engage with Christians on arguments for God or Christianity, we are not dealing with the foundation of their faith. We should not typically expect to change a person's belief, much less their faith position, through argument. In fact, I'd make the case that in certain scenarios, engaging with such arguments, even in a way which successfully undermines those arguments, serves to strengthen their faith and obfuscate its true basis. Say a Christian and a non-Christian.
Yeah.
Okay, so he says that for most Christians, if you were to ask them, if you didn't have this evidence that supports and justifies Christianity, would you retain your Christian faith? And he says that most people would say yes, they would retain their Christian faith in spite of not having this or that piece of evidence that they use to justify their Christian faith. But I like the analogy that Tim McGrew gives, that, I mean, imagine someone asked, what would it take to change your mind that Abraham Lincoln emancipated the slaves, or that Caesar crossed the Rubicon, or was assassinated in the Forum, or what have you, any number of historical propositions that we think are very well justified. Well, I mean, it would take, the evidence would have to look very, very different in order for us to no longer be persuaded of those propositions. And I think the same is true of Christianity, that there's a cumulative case for Christianity. It's not just justified by a single spectacular piece of evidence. Rather, it's justified by a whole network of evidences that point convergently in the direction of Christianity. And I think that people, even implicitly or tacitly, perceive the force of that cumulative case and recognize that it's very robust to being overturned by a single objection, or by losing one or more pieces of evidence that support Christianity. That it's so. I think that sometimes the inner witness of the Holy Spirit, or something that Reformed epistemologists will talk about, I think that oftentimes people are talking rather about this implicit sense of the force of the cumulative case for Christianity. Would you agree with that, Eric, or anything to add there?
Well, yeah, definitely. I mean, I think just in my own experience, and I bet Drew wouldn't think that I was unjustified when I became an atheist as a teenager, because one of the reasons I became an atheist as a teenager is because of the problem of evil, and I was just looking at, like, I don't know, my mother had cancer. I grew up from somewhat of a broken home. My friends had broken homes. There was just a giant flood that just swept up much of the city of St. Louis. And then, of course, you can just look at wars and other natural disasters and different things like that. And so, even though I had never heard a syllogism on the problem of evil, or heard, somebody discuss it like J.L. Mackie or David Hume, or Graham Oppy type of thing, I was able to just kind of grasp intuitively what the problem of evil was. And so, therefore, I quit believing in God. And there wasn't like a whole lot of it was just something that I kind of looked at based on kind of the evidence. But um, as I went on in time, I began to kind of reconsider, and I began to think, well, still is this order that seems to be in the universe. There still seems to be plenty of evidence of design. Or how did we get here? Did everything just come to being uncaused out of nothing for no reason at all? Where am I getting these sense of moral intuitions? Well, again, I never heard any sort of syllogisms on the moral argument or the design argument or different things like that. And I also kind of reasoned, well, if there is evil allowed in the world, then maybe if there is a God, he would know more than I would and may have good reasons to allow it. And so it was reasoning from kind of a natural theology type of basis, just even as a teenager, that I was able to kind of come back to God. But if you threw me to somebody to talk to some sort of atheist philosopher, or even somebody like Drew who might know some arguments against the existence of God, I probably wouldn't have been able to hold my own in a debate. And so I had tacit reasons for rejecting God that weren't super explicit, and I had tacit reasons for coming again to believe in God. I began to read the Bible because I figured if there is such a being as God, chances are he probably would want to give us some sort of revelation. Maybe there's some sort of life after death, that kind of thing. And so I began to look at different systems of belief. I looked at the Quran, I looked at the Bible. I was willing to consider that there was some sort of revelation that would have been available. And as I read through the Gospels, it was difficult to just brush aside the testimonies of different miracles as just mere embellishments. I love the teachings of Jesus. I thought Jesus was a very, very compelling character. But as I looked at the different reports of miracles, I thought, what exactly is this? I don't know what to do with this. This seems to be purporting to be testimony. And as I just continue to read, I would probably recognize different pieces of like verisimilitude in the accounts.
Mhm.
And so I at least became more open to Christianity being true because of that. And so I think, again, I had justification in my belief. I got the sense of the cumulative case. And once I became a Christian, I read Isaiah 53, and it was like the hair on the back of my neck stood up. It was just like, whoa, wait a second. This was written hundreds of years before Jesus. This sure seems to be describing Jesus. And so I think I got a sense of the cumulative case for the existence of God, for the truth of Christianity, even if I wasn't able to explain my beliefs very well to a skeptic or something like that. And Drew's right. It was in sharing my faith and trying to convince other people of the truth of Christianity, and running into skepticism and running into not being able to just questions and things that I wasn't able to answer, that it made me want to know how to answer these different questions. And as I was beginning to learn about apologetics, it was just like, oh, okay. It seems to me like the intuitions that I had in a lot of different ways are being borne out. I think we intuit, like the Kalam cosmological argument, for example, is like, it's based on a lot of very common sense intuitions. The moral argument is based on a lot of common sense intuitions that I think that we all have. And then more evidence would come in as I would look at these things and consider for and against Christianity, that it was like, okay, well, there's actually a lot more going for this in terms of positive evidence. And these negative arguments made against Scripture are just oftentimes just not really that all that plausible in comparison. And so, yeah, I guess it's just kind of a long-winded way to say, I think that a lot of believers are like myself, in the sense that they're not operating without any evidence whatsoever. They're just bad at expressing it. So when you hear like somebody like Ray Comfort say something cringy like, well, every building needs a builder in the middle of a debate to Matt Dillahunty, well, he's bad at explaining things. I certainly wouldn't use that analogy. I'd probably try and say something a little more sophisticated and more philosophical than that and better explained than that. But I think he is drawing on some intuitions that are correct, and I think that he's just kind of an example of that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I completely agree. So Ray Comfort, as you said, will often say that every building needs a builder, so creation therefore requires a creator. And as atheists rightly point out, that argument is circular because the whole debate is whether we're actually living in a creation, right? And but as you said, I think that he's drawing on some common sense intuitions that we are living in a world that appears to be designed for a purpose, especially when you look at biological systems. That one doesn't need a technical understanding of molecular biology to see the incredible evidence of design. And if people want more info on that, then you can go and check out the video I did and the interview I did on your channel recently on intelligent design. Doug Axe has a great book, by the way, called Undeniable: How Biology Confirms Our Intuitions That Life is Designed. Highly recommend that book. You mentioned also Isaiah 53. In my teens, well before I got interested in apologetics, I read Isaiah 53 and other messianic prophetic texts, and it seems to me to be quite compelling for the messianic identity of Jesus of Nazareth. Now, would I have been able to go and debate a Tovia Singer or other Jewish rabbis on Isaiah 53? Well, no, but it doesn't require the technical understanding to see how Isaiah 53 points to Jesus. We only need technical responses to technical arguments. And so I think that the actual justification itself is something that can be grasped by anyone. And then as one becomes acquainted with more technical objections, then one has to dig into the weeds to find out why those objections fail. But I think you're right. Isaiah 53 and other prophetic texts, seeing how so much typology and foreshadowing points to Christ in the Old Testament, looking at, for example, Christ's death coinciding with the Jewish feast of Passover, and the recognizing, the theological import of that, of Christ being the fulfillment of the Passover lamb. And so that tends to confirm his messianic identity because it's at least somewhat more probable on the hypothesis that he is really the Messiah, that he would be raised, he would die on the day of the Feast of Passover, given the theological import of that, than it would have been otherwise. Not conclusive on its own or not sufficient on its own, but it does tend to move the needle in that direction. Or the fact that, so according to Isaiah 53 verses 1-3, the Messiah was supposed to be rejected by his own people, the Jews, and yet nonetheless bring representatives, according to Isaiah 42:6 and Isaiah 49:6, bring representatives of all nations to recognize the God of Israel. Now, who has done that besides the person of Jesus? Well, no one, but it's a remarkable feat. A would-be Messiah that is rejected by his own people, and yet nonetheless brings representatives of all the nations to recognize the God of Israel. Again, perhaps not sufficient, but it does move the needle in the direction of Christianity. And these things are perceivable by those that don't have a particularly technical understanding of the Bible or theology and so forth. You only need the technical responses to the technical objections that get raised by the likes of a Rabbi Tovia Singer or whatnot. Yeah, and also there's, of course, the hallmarks of verisimilitude in the text. That when we read the Gospels and Acts, we intuitively recognize the marks of testimony, even if we didn't, do a debate with Bart Ehrman or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. I want to read a quote. This is from a blog post of Lydia McGrew's that I think is really good, and then we'll go ahead and proceed here. This is a blog post. I can put it in the notes later. It's called What Evidentialism Is Not, and she has a 5-part series on her YouTube channel right now, which is absolutely fantastic. It's going to touch in some of the topics that Jonathan and I are talking about here in more detail, so definitely check out that. But her second point, she writes, evidentialism is not the position that only extremely intelligent people can have good reasons for believing Christianity to be true. She goes on to say, I want to linger on this point to drive it home because those of us into such esoteric fields as probability theory and analytic philosophy tend to discuss and analyze arguments for Christianity in those terms. We can either get the impression or give the impression that a Christian who doesn't think of the arguments in those terms has no evidence. That is incorrect. For example, a person can be seeing the force of internal signs of verisimilitude as undesigned coincidences without being able to give a probabilistic analysis of them. There is a tremendous amount of tacit reasoning that takes place, and that is not irrational because it is inexplicit. Grandma, the hypothetical, unintellectual sweet lady at your church, may be seeing a lot more about the credibility of the gospel narratives than she ever articulated explicitly. She goes on to say, something similar can be said about the argument from design, which struck Whittaker Chambers. For those of you who don't know, Whittaker Chambers was like a former communist spy here in America. He ended up writing for, I believe, Time Magazine, at National Review, and different things like that. But anyways, it struck Whittaker Chambers non-philosophically but powerfully in an all-at-once fashion when he was looking at his little girl's ear as she sat in the high chair. The same is true of other arguments as well. Indeed, the first cause is supposed to work via some fairly powerful a priori intuitions, and there is no reason to believe that a non-philosopher cannot be accessing the intuition that nothing comes from nothing, even if you can't discuss it in philosophical terms. And so, yeah, I think she just kind of hits the nail on the head here. And so I think believers, the point, not to belabor it too much, guys, is that believers in the pew, the average person that you go to church with, is seeing a lot more evidence for God that's rationally justifying their beliefs than Drew is giving them credit here. Let's continue here.
Christian hold a public debate about the moral nature of God. The Christian brings out sophisticated philosophical arguments, the non-Christian engages with them, points are won and lost on either side, but the non-Christian comes out ahead in the end. This is still an overall victory for the Christian, as their goals were well served even though they lost. The outcome of the debate on the philosophical reasons for belief is largely inconsequential to that belief. However, the outsider engaging with such arguments as if they are consequential to that belief tacitly endorses the idea that Christian belief is based on some rational line of thought, rather than founded in belonging and reinforced through behavior. Consider this statement from apologist William Lane Craig.
First of all, I think that I would tell them that they need to understand the proper relationship between faith and reason. And my view here is that the way in which I know Christianity is true is first and foremost on the basis of the witness of the Holy Spirit in my heart. And that this gives me a self-authenticating means of knowing that Christianity is true wholly apart from the evidence. And therefore, if in some historically contingent circumstances the evidence that I have available to me should turn against Christianity, I don't think that that controverts the witness of the Holy Spirit. In such a situation, I should regard that as simply a result of the contingent circumstances that I'm in, and that if I were to pursue this with due diligence and with time, I would discover that in fact the evidence, if I could get the correct picture, would support exactly what the witness of the Holy Spirit tells me. So I think that's very important to get the relationship between faith and reason right. Otherwise, what that means is that our faith is dependent upon the shifting sands of evidence and argument, which change from person to person, place to place, and generation to generation. Whereas the Holy Spirit and his testimony gives every generation and every person immediate access to a knowledge of God and the truth of Christianity that's independent of the shifting sands of time and place and person and historical contingency.
This thinking fits into my model perfectly. Even for a philosopher like Craig, belief is not founded in reason or logical argumentation. Such argumentation is an additional but still unnecessary reinforcement of his belief. It is a secondary warrant, if belonging and behavior are the primary warrant. When debating him, Craig's interlocutor is never interacting with the basis for his belief, only his secondary warrant. Assuming most of Craig's Christian audience is like Craig in this way, and I believe they are, their
Okay, so I wanted to stop there because he's assuming that everybody else is just believes for the same reasons that Craig does, and like Craig is espousing what's called Reformed epistemology, or he has kind of his own version of Holy Spirit epistemology or different things like that. I don't agree with Reformed epistemology, Jonathan. I know you don't agree with Reformed epistemology. So maybe we should discuss that for just a little bit, because it seems like these skeptics, especially lately, especially with some recent, what I think are comments that I don't agree with about Craig in this regard, that he made about, even if the evidence, even if there was just a 1 in a million chance that Christianity is true, that he would want to believe it, and that, there was all kinds of things that came out. And it just seems like skeptics are trying to constantly bring Craig out as some kind of a cudgel. So tell me, what are your thoughts on Reformed epistemology? Why do you reject it?
Yeah, so I think that William and Craig's statements in that video and elsewhere on that matter are unhelpful. And I am not a Reformed epistemologist. My confidence in Christianity is grounded and justified wholly by the public evidences for Christianity. Now, I don't think that the internal witness of the Holy Spirit in a veridical sense is normative for Christians. I don't have the sort of experience that William Lane Craig claims to have. Maybe he does. I'm not saying he doesn't, but I don't have access to it. I don't have any sort of inner testimony that I would consider to be veridical and sufficient to justify Christian belief. And so my confidence in Christianity, as I said, is wholly grounded in the public evidence. And so if I didn't have the public evidence, if the evidence were not confirmatory of Christianity, then I would cease at that point to be a Christian, because it's very important to me to have well justified beliefs that are actually based on and grounded by evidence. And so I think that it doesn't seem to me from conversations I've had with others that it's a normative thing for Christians to have that sort of internal veridical experience. I know that Tim and Lydia also would say that they don't have that sort of experience. Now, it's possible in principle for someone to have some sort of personal experience that does justify belief for them, such as a witness to a miracle, or something like that. I haven't had that in my own experience. Eric, do you have anything to add there?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think I would just say that not every Christian is a believer in the Reformed epistemology kind of thing. It's what are the words that I'm looking for here? To me, it's kind of hard to distinguish it from the claims of like a Mormon who says that they sense the burning of the bosom, from reading the Book of Mormon. And I think one of the frustrating things that I've seen with Craig is he's like, well, this spirit can serve as like a defeater. So even in the face of all these other contrary arguments, you just have this sense. It's like, well, that is he going to say that all of these people who have like rejected their faith, like that defeating defeater didn't rise up? Maybe there's something I'm not totally understanding. People are free to correct me. It's not that I haven't read Craig on these particular things, but ultimately I don't find it particularly persuasive. Now, I've had, several religious types of experience that help strengthen my faith to some extent or another. But they're not like the entire basis of my faith. One of the reasons I became a Christian is because I did have some sort of a religious experience, but it was after studying the Gospels and becoming more open to them to actually being testimony and believing in God, that additional experience just kind of like sort of pushed me over the edge a little bit. And I've had other experiences as well, but one of them in particular, where it was like just knowledge that I wouldn't have had otherwise, that I was able to, it had some sort of confirmation in the external world. I won't get into all the details about that, but again, I don't think that that's something that every believer has. I just kind of agree with you there. And I would just encourage skeptics to stop, kind of beating us over the head with Craig, because just not everybody believes in his particular religious epistemology. And yeah, that's basically it in a nutshell.
No,
so
I totally agree. And as you said, it's very difficult to objectively distinguish the inner witness of the Spirit, as William and Craig would talk about, from the Mormons' claim to receive the burning in the bosom that Moroni 10:4 in the Book of Mormon would describe. I've talked to many Mormons, and they have a very similar epistemology to Wilhelm Lane Craig, where no matter how much evidence you present against Mormonism, they will always fall back on Moroni 10:4, that they pray to receive a burning in the bosom, and that itself justifies their faith, even if they don't have any reasons for it, and even if there's a ton of evidence against it. And so if you have a religious epistemology that can also be used by others to justify a set of beliefs that we know are false, then it might be a sign that your epistemology is faulty at some level.
Yeah, exactly. All right, here we go.
Belief, much less their faith, is not liable to change regardless of the result of the debate. This makes debating arguments for God or Christianity almost risk-free for the Christian, but still holds potential to reinforce their secondary warrant if they do well in the debate. It also creates the illusion, especially to outsiders, that Christian faith is based on reason, since the Christian debater seems practiced in argumentation. Christian debates, logical argumentation, and apologetics serve primarily...
That was kind of a snide comment there.
Very, very patronizing and condescending. I mean, atheists don't like it, and rightly so, when Christians will say that the reason why the reason for every deconvert, or the reason why anyone is an atheist, is because they want sexual freedom.
Yeah.
That's the real underlying reason why people are atheists. That's the real underlying reason why people deconvert. Now, I don't believe that's the case, but there are Christians that say it's the case, and atheists get rightly frustrated by that and find it very patronizing and condescending and very dismissive. And quite frankly, I find the same thing to be true of Drew's comments here. I do believe in the existence of God and that he's revealed himself in the person of Christ through the public evidence. And so that's and to say that that's not really the reason that I believe is akin, I think, to the parallel where Christians will say that similar things about non-believers. So I think that's quite unhelpful coming from Drew. Anything to add there, Eric?
Yeah, I mean, I just see this as kind of like a Bulverism sort of thing, where it's basically the assumption and assertion that an argument is flawed or false because of somebody's suspected motives or social identity or other characteristics associated with their identity. It has nothing to do with the arguments themselves. And like I said, I was an atheist for a while based on tacit beliefs that weren't like wholly ways, that I could explain and would be explicit about. If a skilled Christian apologist came to me and tried to argue with me, I wouldn't probably know what to say. But I don't think that I was like completely unjustified in my atheism. I was just focused on one particular piece of evidence at that particular time, and I wasn't looking at the big picture. And so I don't think that he would say that about me back when I was in that particular state. So I think it's kind of weird. And I didn't just apostatize because I just wanted to sin. And if somebody said that to me, I would have been offended. So yeah, I agree with you there. I think we can sit and point at motives all day long, but it doesn't really get us anywhere.
To be fair, I don't think that Drew is saying that the arguments are flawed or unsound as a result of those alternative reasons for believing that he thinks most Christians have. Rather, he's saying that there's no point in participating in dialogue with Christians because the reasons that they're putting forward in those dialogues are not really the reason that drove them to those conclusions. And I do think that that's quite patronizing and condescending. And at least for me, they are the reasons that justify my beliefs.
Right. All right.
As a PR campaign for Christianity. They strengthen Christians' secondary warrant, while for non-Christians, they advertise Christianity as ultimately concerned with reason and logic, despite what they may have observed elsewhere. Does this mean there is no use in engaging with arguments for Christianity? Well, despite the fact that this view has made me quite uninterested in engaging in public debates, specifically myself, I wouldn't go that far. My friend Alex of Cosmic Skeptic is constantly engaging in these debates, so I decided to reach out and ask him why. Do you think that for most people, Christian belief is based in reasoning and argumentation?
No, it's not the case for most people that any form of religious belief, I would say, is based in argument or reason. Some people will claim that that is the case. There are some high-profile conversions like Anthony Flew, who at least claims that he was moved by reason to adopt Christianity.
Yeah, he was a deist.
Yeah, just to clarify that factually, Antony Flew was not ever a Christian.
No.
Though he did say that Christianity was the religion to beat. If there was any religion that was true, it would be Christianity. But he never, at least so far as we know, he never converted to Christianity. He converted as far as theism. I think he went even beyond deism to a theistic perspective. And the design arguments, the teleological arguments, including the biological arguments, by the way, were instrumental in changing his mind to theism. But he never, in fact, embraced Christianity.
Yep.
But I think that people who do make such a change represent a vanishingly small minority of people who just happen to be Christian, for example. Being billions of them, the vast majority of them, I think, are going to have a more confessional, emotional relationship with God than a rational one.
If that's the case, if people are not making the decision to believe based on these arguments, on reason, why debate these things, especially so publicly with Christians?
That's a very good question. And I think the reason why I like to participate in these debates is for a few reasons. One is that I like to prove that I'm actually doing the heavy lifting. Because although most people, I think, who believe the Christian theism is true, will, in my estimation, believe so mostly on something like the witness of the Holy Spirit, or they'll have some kind of personal religious experience that actually motivates the conversion. If you're having a conversation with them and you say that you don't believe what they're saying, they're not going to use that to try to convert you as much as saying, well, you need to read up on these arguments. You need to understand that there's good historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus and this kind of thing. And so even though I'm a bit suspicious as to whether this is the area where I would have my mind changed, one benefit is that I'm able to say, look, I have considered these arguments. So at least ostensibly, if you're claiming that there are arguments for God's existence that should change a rational person's mind, I can say, well, look, I have considered them and they haven't done it. So what's next? That's one reason of doing it. Another reason is because from a theistic perspective, even if argumentation is not the motivating factor in causing a conversion, it might be an instance of legitimization. It might be an opportunity to intellectually legitimize a belief that came about through an irrational process. I think where arguments in religious philosophy really shine is in helping to legitimize a person's prior experience. If they've had some kind of experience of Christianity, Jesus comes to them in a dream or something, and they become totally convinced that Christianity is true, but they feel like they've got an intellectual gap that they can't justify to themselves, they can use argument and reason as a tool to help them get over that. Now, that sounds a little bit unfair maybe to them, but this is something, for example, that Alvin Plantinga has said about his own argument. The modal ontological argument is one of the most popular arguments discussed in religious philosophy. But Plantinga says himself that the reason this argument is useful is not to convince an atheist that God exists, but rather for somebody who already believes that God exists, just to prove that it's rational to believe so. It's not supposed to have any motivating force in terms of changing somebody's mind. It's just supposed to be a tool that somebody who already believes in God can use to ground their belief in something that can be called rational. So, if you read Plantinga's argument from the horse's mouth, as it were, then you'll find that, look, it's not an insult to say that these arguments don't move people to belief in God. It's not even what they're designed for.
Okay, now I have a little bit of a charge for you.
Sure.
How would you respond to the charge that debating a Christian publicly tacitly endorses the idea that Christian faith is contingent on having reasons or arguments for its truth?
I can see why you might think you've caught me out there, Drew, because, of course, here I am extolling the virtue of religious experience and entering into various communities and living life rather than sitting in your books. But then, what is my profession after all? The way that I see this is I think, look, I'm highly suspicious of the claim that I'm going to be convinced of God's existence by some form of syllogism. I think that if God is lurking somewhere to be discovered, it might be in a meaningful experience, it might be in a piece of poetry, it might be in whatever makes music beautiful, it might be in the basis of aesthetic. It's not going to be at the bottom of a microscope. Seems like a weird place for God to finally place the evidence of his existence. But if somebody comes to me and says, well, look, you're wrong about that. I have an argument that should convince any rational person. I think bring it on. I'm a philosopher before I'm an atheist. I think to myself, I'm interested in philosophical questions. I'm interested in questions of knowledge and epistemology and the questions of the philosophical foundations of science and ethics and these kinds of things. And philosophy of religion is just one of these things that I think is just fun. I think it's interesting. I don't think it's going to convince me. But somebody approaches me, sends me an email and says, well, hey, guess what? I'm going to change your mind and I'm going to do it in front of an audience. I think, fine. I go into that room not expecting that this is even the area in which my mind is likely to be changed. But of course, I have to be open to it in order to accept the debate. Otherwise, what's the point? But I think to myself, look, I don't want to be misunderstood here. I don't want people to think that because I haven't found a good argument for God's existence, I think that theism is therefore off the table for me. I think that religious experience is a perfectly legitimate way to come to belief in God. It's just not one that you can share with other people. It's by nature private. And so when somebody says that they want to stand in a public forum and talk to me in such a way that they think is going to convince me, I think that sounds astonishing to me, and I would love to see what they've got on offer. So that's why I do it. I think it's interesting. I think it's a bold claim that somebody's going to manage to convince me, despite the wealth of religious history, of famous conversions due to religious experience. They're going to convince me by putting a syllogism on a piece of paper. I think I've just got to see it.
All right, that is definitely the perspective I wanted to get before I continued with this video. So I appreciate you chatting with me.
Of course, man. Anytime.
Okay, stop there.
Yeah. All right. There's a lot there. So
Right. And Drew's question to Alex there again is just incredibly condescending.
yeah.
And the reasons why we believe Christianity to be true is because of the public evidence, and to say, well, there's really some other deeper seated motivation for why you are a Christian, I think is very patronizing and very dismissive. And I know that Drew wouldn't like Christians to make similar statements in regards to atheists or people like Drew who've deconverted from Christianity and try to do play the motive mongering game, and to say, well, it's not really worth debating Christians because that's not really the reasons why they're persuaded. I just find that to be incredibly patronizing. Anything to say, Eric, in regards to Alex's response?
Well, yeah, I mean, you debated the guy. I don't think that you, the way that he spelled it out, and maybe he didn't mean it this way, and anybody can say something when they're in the heat of a conversation, but it made it sound like anybody who's challenging him to a debate, like, I don't think that when he gets an offer for a debate that somebody's going to say, well, I'm going to prove it to you. I think most of the times when people do a debate, it's just for the edification of the audience and to kind of educate people of the merits of their side versus the other side. And so, and for him to just say, well, you know, I think it's incredible that you're going to put something in a syllogism that you think is going to convince me. Well, I don't think I ever go necessarily with that expectation of I'm going to convince you with a syllogism. I think it's just going to be, I would like to at least nudge you into reconsidering your worldview by presenting some sort of publicly available data for you to consider. And I don't expect it to change your mind in the heat of a debate. I don't think there's an atheist that's going to go, oh, you know what? You're right. I'm going to convert right here on the spot in front of this audience. And so I just thought it was strange the way you worded that. I don't know. So.
Exactly. And frankly, any justification for a belief could be expressed in syllogistic form.
Right.
So for him to simply dismiss syllogisms as a mode of expressing your justification, I mean, any justification could be expressed that way. It's just an explicit form of the justification for. And personally, I also don't find syllogisms to be, they're not my preferred way of presenting an argument. In any case, I prefer to argue much more probabilistically and inductively. But
right.
I understand a lot of people like William and Craig especially do prefer to present syllogisms. And I do think that it unfortunately has a tendency to reinforce a popular misconception that both Christians and atheists sometimes run with, which is that you have to be able to justify the conclusion from each of the arguments taken individually. And so an atheist will sometimes inspect the cosmological argument, find it to be inconclusive, move on to the fine-tuning arguments, find them to be inconclusive, and move on to biological design, find it to be inconclusive, or what have you, rather than considering whether the arguments taken in aggregate are sufficient to justify the conclusion. And that's why I prefer to argue more inductively and probabilistically rather than deductively.
Yeah, I don't sit and argue that the argument that I'm going to give you should persuade all rational people who hear the argument. And so I think an argument is good in the sense that, and to the extent that it shifts, you know, the ratio of probabilities in favor of its conclusion. And so not, you know, if I talk to you about the Kalam cosmological argument or the argument from design, I don't expect you to just kind of roll over and say, yes, God exists. But I think that it should at least cause you to think that, okay, well, maybe if I gave the probability of theism being true is like 1%, I think it should at least move you to, you know, maybe 10% if I give you one of them. If I give you them cumulatively and your explanations to explain away all of the different arguments are more ad hoc, well, then I might say, okay, well, now consider that you are probably being irrational because you're having to make all of these different moves in order to escape the conclusion. But yeah, I just thought it was a funny way of him
Right.
putting it. I do appreciate Cosmic Skeptic in the sense that I do think overall he tries to understand the arguments a little bit
Yeah,
better
I
than
agree.
for sure. I mean, even watching one of his videos where he was doing like a tier list with Joe Schmidt on the arguments for God, even Cosmic Skeptic was kind of interrupting Joe and saying, wait, I don't think you're getting the resurrection argument quite correct here. And he's saying, I think it's a little stronger than you're giving it. And so I do appreciate him for
Right.
that. So anyway.
Yeah, totally. I completely agree with that, and yeah, I applaud Alex for his attempts to properly understand and indeed to represent the arguments for Christianity. I think he does a good job in that respect, and I've appreciated the both the public dialogues I've had with Alex as well as the private exchanges I've had with him as well. One other point I wanted to make is that a couple of times in the last few weeks, both on Facebook and on Twitter, I've posted an animation of a molecular system. I posted on Twitter an animation of the sense of hearing and how that works. And I also on Facebook posted an animation of DNA replication and the replication machinery that replicates our DNA to prepare for cell division. And I asked the atheist community that is connected with me on social media, if you were to watching an animation like this, which is an accurate though simplified representation of what's going on at the molecular level, to what extent, if any, does this move your credence in the direction of theism? And I was shocked to find that there were many atheists that responded that said it doesn't change their credence level at all in theism, and that just to me just baffles me how it can't even change people's credence at all in the direction of theism. And for me, these systems seem to scream for an explanation by design, which of course is confirmatory of a broadly theistic perspective. And so if I were to say, well, there's no point in debating atheists because after all, they're not going to change their minds on the basis of evidence after all. I mean, you would think that was very overly generalizing and quite patronizing.
Yeah, for sure. And I think anybody on any side should say this particular argument or this particular piece of evidence would move the needle one way or the other. And yeah, it's strange when I hear Christians or atheists say that. I mean, to me, I can at least admit that, yeah, there are pieces of evidence that go against my view. And it's just kind of a mark of somebody who is a little intellectually dishonest if they can't admit that. But it seems like Drew is kind of maybe overly generalizing and saying that, the vast majority of Christians are this particular way. I don't know. So I don't know if that's the case or not. I don't think so. But anyway, we only got a few more minutes. I'll keep going here.
I think Alex does make some good points here. Obviously, I've spoken about arguments for God in my videos many times, and I don't regret doing so. There are good reasons to speak about these arguments, and I don't mean to say that they're wholly irrelevant to belief, just that they're rarely central to it. That said, if you can think of any additional reasons to address these arguments, let me know in the comments, and I'd be very happy to hear them. What undermines Christian faith? If my model of Christian belief formation is accurate, it would predict that a Christian whose sense of belonging is weakened or lost is more likely to leave the faith than one whose secondary warrant for belief is lost. It would also predict that continued interruption of behavior, rituals like worship, devotional times, prayer, and the like, would undermine faith more significantly as well. When certain Christians say things like, "I've been publicly debating with non-believers for years and years, and my faith is still just as strong as ever," I can't help but think, sure, but you probably belong to a Christian community. Your family probably considers Christianity a must. You probably engage in emotionally powerful rituals like worship on a weekly basis, and other rituals like prayer and devotional times almost.
Yep.
So, I mean, one could say the same thing about atheists. I mean, atheists say that they've been interacting. I mean, Alex just said he's been interacting with Christians for many, many years, and he's and I do actually think Alex has made some progress in at least raising his credence levels with respect to Christianity. But there are many atheists that would say that they've interacted with many Christians over many years, and it hasn't made them more open to Christianity, or they're still unconvinced by Christianity. Drew has said this several times during this video. So, I mean, that's, of course, a parallel example to the one that he's giving in regards to Christians. And if I were to simply dismiss atheists on the basis of the fact that, well, they must be, they're people like Drew and other atheists are going to atheist conferences and they're putting out atheist YouTube videos and engage, and they've got an atheist community and so forth. And therefore, we really should just dismiss them or dismiss their arguments or dismiss what they have to say. I think that that's, again, very patronizing and quite condescending.
Yeah, definitely. And it's just, the other thing that he said that I thought was interesting is like, well, if Christians are reading the Bible, going to church, doing all of these different things, engaging in a community, practicing spiritual disciplines, well, of course, that's reinforcing your faith. Well, if God exists, we would expect that he would meet human beings' existential needs. And by participating in different things like church, serving in a church, attending church, giving, praying, reading the Bible, all these different things, that they would provide some sort of benefit. You know what I'm saying? And so, I mean, it's just kind of crazy. It's almost, he doesn't suggest this, although I've heard another semi-popular atheist YouTuber kind of suggest this, is just stop doing all that Christian behavior and see if you still believe. And it's just kind of like, well, the Christian behavior is coming as a response to evidence, which we've distinguished, whether that's tacitly, in the back of our minds that we're not able to explain very well, or explicit or not, but we're doing these things in a response to that. It would be weird if we got no benefit out of doing these particular behaviors whatsoever that weren't reinforcing kind of some of our beliefs. And it seems just kind of silly to just say, well, drop all this stuff and see if you still believe. It's like, okay, that's like, if I stopped talking to my wife and we quit spending time with each other, of course I'm going to grow cold towards her. Of course I might think like, why did we even marry each other in the first place? And I know he's not fully suggesting that Christians do that, although I've heard other people say that. I just think that's kind of a silly thing to do. People are emotional beings as well as rational people. And so we can have emotional doubt that is brought on by the way that we respond or fail to respond to the evidence that we have. And so, it's just kind of a weird thing to say. I don't know. What do you think?
No, I completely agree with what you said.
Okay. All right. Let's wrap up here.
Daily? Of course, you still believe. That's just to be expected if you act as a Christian all the time. Now, I'm not in the business of wholly destroying Christianity or convincing all Christians to leave the faith, so I've never issued some kind of public challenge like disengage from Christian community and ritual for a year and see what happens. What I am very interested in is revealing how Christian practices and institutions, in many contexts, can perpetuate religious harm. This is why I've produced videos about how groupish thinking can cause widespread harm, especially when Christians codify it into doctrine. This is why I've addressed how Christian worship serves to create conformity in the church and even creates the opportunity for worshipers to mistake the will of the church leadership for the will of God. This is why I've spoken so extensively about my life as a Christian and how my environment was so carefully designed to keep me from seeing the religious harm it caused. Having done this, though, I've struck the faith of many in a place that I think hurts more than a solid counter to an argument for God, in their sense of belonging and their confidence in their rituals, their primary warrant for belief. This is of course anecdotal, but I've received far more vitriol from Christians in response to my discussion of systemic religious harm, the psychology of spiritual experience, and my own apostasy than I've ever received in response to counters to popular apologetics. This is what happens when you threaten the primary warrant of Christian faith, even if you don't mean to destroy that faith. So, arguing about the philosophy of Christianity can be fun and can serve a purpose, but if one wants to mitigate religious harm more substantially, they must address the faith's actual source of power, its creation of behavior and belonging. Failing to address those aspects of the faith for the sake of engaging only in philosophical arguments means treating as crucial an aspect of faith that is largely unimportant. Thanks for watching.
All right, that's basically it. So, closing thoughts there.
Yeah, I think that, as I've said a few times, Drew's whole approach to this topic is incredibly condescending. He generalizes experiences that he's had with some Christians to this is the way that all Christians are. And we could do the same thing with atheists. We could say that we could dismiss all atheists because of our experience with a small subset of the atheist community. And we have to really take people seriously as individuals and find out, okay, what is their justification for belief, and what arguments are they going to adduce in support of their set of beliefs. And I think for both of us, the primary justification for belief is the public evidence rather than the personal subjective experience. And that's essentially what I'd say in response and in conclusion.
Yeah. So my only concern is like a video like this. I mean, people are free to make the content, whatever content that they want to make, but I feel like it just kind of gets the discussion more on somebody's psychology. And it can just kind of create a sense of like, this is why you really believe what you believe, when talking to somebody and actually asking questions why they believe what they believe would be far more helpful. And not to just, I think this overgeneralizes to a point that it could create problems with conversations that if Drew wants to move people more towards his view, then it would probably be better to find out why each individual Christian believes why they believe what they believe, and actually ask them, versus just kind of assuming that you just like your sense of belonging from your church and you like your spiritual habits and rituals. They make you feel good. I mean, I don't know. That's just it. There's a lot of people I know that don't get a whole lot of anything out of reading their Bible or praying sometimes, or they have certain seasons of where things are just kind of dry, but they're just, wanting to just continue these behaviors because they know just that they will be helpful for them in the long run, and they will help them to think right. And it's just more of a benefit in the long run. I guess I'm kind of belaboring the point here, but yeah, I just think that this kind of stuff is going to shut down productive conversation more than it would help.
Absolutely.
Find out why a person is like that. Find out why an atheist is an atheist, and ask them individual questions. Don't just assume that it's a sociological or psychological thing, and it just goes both ways. And so anyways, I really appreciate you coming on, Jonathan, to talk about this video. It's gotten a ton of play. I've had lots of people asking me questions about it. And so I think that as a community of apologists and counter-apologists, we need more dialogue, more discussion. And like I said, my concern is that this is going to shut those things down, because ultimately we should be after what is true, and not just thinking about what is motivating the person to believe what is true. And I think we found this too in counseling doubters, is sometimes people are so overly worried about their own cognitive bias, and that they're thinking that they're engaging in some sort of confirmation bias every time they look at the evidence for Christianity, that they start to doubt and question their own ability to examine the evidence. And I think these kind of videos can create that, maybe with some Christians. And I want to say, hey, you're probably not so biased that you can't fairly examine the evidences for Christianity. And so don't let stuff like this cause you to feel gaslit, questioning your own reality. So
totally. And this is a phenomenon. This is a cognitive bias that I've called the disconfirmation bias, right? So we've all heard of the confirmation bias, where you tend to only register the facts and evidences that tend to confirm your prior set of beliefs, and we tend to downplay or ignore the evidences that disconfirm our set of beliefs. And I think that there's some people, especially people that we talk to at talkaboutdoubts.com, that get so hung up about their confirmation bias and become so anxious about the way that might color their interpretation of the data, that they go to the other, the kind of a converse confirmation bias. They fall down the other side, and they engage in disconfirmation bias. And where they are more inclined to trust sources that disconfirm their beliefs than those that confirm them. And so I think that we have to be wary and cautious about that. And I second everything that you said.
Yeah, I mean, I would think most of these people would respond to a request for jury duty. Well, I mean, they would have to, but I think that they would not think that, well, like, I can't possibly be a good juror because, I have all of this particular bias, but then they ratchet up this fear of their own bias when it comes to looking at the evidence for Christianity, because it's like a religious belief. And no, I think most human beings can, look at evidence fairly, if they are willing to spend the time and hear the argument. And so it just sometimes takes a little extra work and a little extra thinking and putting some effort into it. But yeah, so anyways, I'm glad we were able to do this. And hopefully if Drew happens to watch it somehow, that he takes it in the heart that it is given. And we definitely appreciate some of the issues that he's raised, because they are issues that are worth raising. So again, be sure to check out Talk About Doubts if you are having questions about the faith, whether you're a believer who has questions about the faith and maybe are struggling in a particular area, or even if you're a skeptic and you were a Christian and maybe you're open to coming back, and you just have some questions that maybe you feel like weren't resolved before, feel free to go to the website, fill out a form, and Jonathan, you will put somebody in touch with them, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Talkaboutdoubts.com.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks guys for joining me on this stream, and you have a great rest of your day.